Welcome to the lecture series of Public Theology, a cooperation of the Berlin Institute for Public Theology, the Bayersnau D Center for Public Theology, and the Lutheran World Federation.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all our friends from around the world, both in those interested in public theology, those who are public theologians, and those who are teaching public theology, and of course, practitioners as well. It's really a joy for us to have a wonderful panel today, for us to talk about the approaches to doing public theology, both in the past, today, and the future. Now, with us, we have Reverend Dr. and Professor Sebastian Kim, who is the Robert Wiley Professor of Renewal in Public Life, now based in Fuller Theological, teaching at Fuller Theological Seminary. So it's lovely to have you with us, Professor Sebastian Kim. And then we have also with us Reverend Dr. Seferosa Carroll. She's the Program Executive for the World Council of Churches Mission from the Margins and the Ecumenical Indigenous Peoples Network. So it's lovely to have you with us too, Seferosa. And we have Professor Reverend Dr. Nico Koopman, who is the Professor of Public Theology and Ethics and the Vice President of Stellenbosch University. So we really have a very interesting panel with us, not only in terms of your academic expertise, but also from where you're located, the context that you are in, and also where you have come from. So thank you very much. So I would like to just start off maybe with Sebastian. You have written on public theology, and of course you have edited volumes about it as well. But I guess maybe let's start a bit more personally. What is your approach to doing public theology? And could you share with us maybe your distinctive contribution and elements that you want to emphasize?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sivin. My own interest in public theology really started from my own context. I am a South Korean, and so obviously in Korean context, the political division between the North and South is the key issue. And so I would like to say that public theology as a bridge building or the kind of tool for or catalyst for reconciliation, because the North and South is divided, but also in South Korea, we are also deeply divided along the line of progressive and conservative. And I think that's a deep problem for both Christians and non-Christians. And the 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about God reconciled us through Christ and called us for the ministry of reconciliation. But we are deeply divided and often refuse to be reconcilers. So I was interested in this context of reconciliation, peace and reconciliation. So I conducted various research projects on peace and reconciliation through a series of consultations and international conferences in various countries. So we had one of the conferences we had in Korea. We invited various church leaders and theologians and practitioners to Seoul. And one day we visited the DMZ and the border between the North and South. I think that was a tremendous experience for those who participated in, not only for them, but also many of the South Koreans. We never visited the DMZ before. So that was a striking experience. So I've been working on this issue of reconciliation. But along the line of the research, I thought the issue of peace and justice is also very important when it comes to reconciliation, because we often talk about peace and getting together, understanding each other, and forgiveness, and so on. But without justice, that doesn't lead into the sustainable peace. So I think the passage struck me was Psalm 85, verse 10, justice and peace will kiss each other. I think that was a really striking passage for me. So I was have been working on the justice and peace issues. And I soon realized that that's not only issue of conflict and peace building, but I think it's in many ways most aspect of our life. When you talk about the common good, the overcoming polarization in our political life, economic life, and social life, I think it affects in everyday lives. So I've been working on the theology of reconciliation and also the kind of overcoming polarization, because often theology also reinforces this, because we have often kind of clear idea of good and evil, right and wrong, us and them, and Christians and non-Christians, and justice and injustice. And I think that often we talk about justice, often it relates to our own group's self-interest. So I think, how do we overcome this division, polarization? I think that has been my concern, and I have been working on this. So I thought that's quite an important aspect of public theology.
Thank you. Wow, this is very rich, because there are various elements, and as far as it seems to me that you have repeated very strongly reconciliation as like the core, but you're not forgetting other aspects around it, whether it's peace, whether it's justice, and of course the problems of polarization, division, so forth. And this is really relevant, especially even in our times, not only in Korea, but also in your current country of residence. I believe we have been following with much interest. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to turn to Seferosa, and the title of your position is interesting. It's mission from the margins already, and I guess that's probably an interesting place to start. But also, we noticed that when it comes to public theology, some people might say, "Okay, is this just a men's thing?" You know, even now we have 3 of us men here, but there are many women, and I've done a public webinar on women doing public theology as well. So I guess there are a range of insights that you could contribute. For this first question, your approach, and what do you see as your distinctive?
Thank you, Sivin. I guess I should say that I didn't actually start off as a public theologian. I started off as a contextual theologian. And I'd have to say that my entry into public theology is somewhat like a slow conversion. And I say this because when I first started my theological studies, contextuality was really important. I'm a legacy of colonization and Christian missions. So the turn to experience as a starting point was very important for me and for doing theology, and also for the process of decolonization or decolonizing myself. I'm still decolonizing. And also, I was kind of reluctant, I think, to name myself as a public theologian. And I think part of that was a resistance to the academy as privilege, and also to labeling, because, you know, we kind of go, oh, you're in this box and that box. And I, you know, didn't feel that I quite fit the box. But what was happening as I was doing my theology, there were around 3 themes that are recurring in what I write, and that is to do with home, hospitality, and migration. Because I'm a migrant, Pacific Island migrant to Australia. So the question of what it means to be at home, what it means to be a migrant, what it means to experience racism, what it means to be welcomed into a host church and to belong in a host church as an equal, not as the guest. These were all important questions for me, and also for migrants as well in general. And as I began to explore these questions, the public dimensions of these questions became more and more clear. For example, if we looked at the theme of home, we have to deal with feminism and this nice kind of divide between the private and the public, and how we've kind of been socialized to think in those ways in terms of women's place being the private, and of course leadership and men's place being in the public. Also, the division between religion or faith being in the private and everything else is in the public. So these distinctions were becoming more and more clear to me in terms of its public dimension. When you also deal with home, you're also dealing with the question of climate change displacement. I come from the Pacific. So, the Pacific is at the forefront of climate change, and there are 5 low-lying atolls that are actually going to have to be dealing with at some stage the displacement and losing home. So, again, that's a public dimension of home. It was also around questions of nation, belonging to Australia. Oceania is the context in which I moved and grew up in. And so, Australia as a nation were kind of really important questions that I had to work with in terms of looking at the migration issue. Hospitality, again, is not just a private thing, it's also the public context of hospitality. And then, of course, I talked about migration. And so when I moved into this role at the World Council of Churches, Mission from the Margins actually encompasses a number of issues, but the main ones I deal with are migration and racism and Indigenous peoples. And again, if we look at Indigenous peoples and the doctrine of discovery, we're also having to rethink, reclaim, reframe that whole kind of narrative. And we're still trying to do it because the doctrine of discovery became the international law of colonialism. So I guess for me, that was my entry into public theology. And, it got to the stage where I could not, but actually accept that this was the space and my location for doing theology. In terms of Mission from the Margins, I guess a developing strand out of this, and this is something that Sebastian Kim has written on, is the relationship and the dialogue and the engagement between public theology and missiology. And I think for us at the World Council of Churches is the move into a public missiology. I believe that's our next step in terms of developing the theology of mission from the margins. Still a very contested concept. And the other thing I want to say also about working with the World Council of Churches is that I have a counterpart, and that's the Churches Commission on International Affairs. And what makes this partnership a really good one, I think, in terms of theology and practice is that the CWME and Faith in Order, we work with theology because we have to. And the CCIA is kind of like the public kind of face where we actually engage with UN instruments and all the public, policies. And so I think for me, my approach to public theology, and I think that's everybody's approach to public theology, is that it must be out of its nature, it is multi and interdisciplinary. I don't think we can avoid that. And I guess that's one of the things that I really like about this space. So so that's just kind of my location and where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Seferosa. It's, again, another very insightful comment from you. And I guess all of us here would say, including myself, that we all arise as we think and write as and do think theology as contextual theologians. But of course, context is public. Now it's not just about the private context. And you've mentioned so many other aspects about now in the context of the World Council of Churches, how you interact with other colleagues and how public theology is done linked with mission and also the international affairs. And I can relate to that as well, the aspect of advocacy, public policies, and public theology. That's a very interesting relationship. and how is theology articulated in this space, especially in the UN space that I think both of us are familiar with in where we are in Geneva. Now, Nico, coming from South Africa, everyone has this image of what South Africa is and what kind of theology that arises out of that. But it would be interesting to hear from you. What is your approach in doing public theology and sharing your distinctive perspective and your contribution to it as well? So over to you, Nico.
Thank you, colleague Sivin and colleagues. It's good to journey with you, colleague Seferosa and colleague Sebastian, and together in this fashion. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and I lived through the transition from apartheid to a young democracy. And I'm very glad that I experienced recently the 27th birthday of democratic South Africa. So during the time of apartheid South Africa, I experienced directly how we were dehumanized and our dignity was violated. We experienced various wounds. We experienced injustice. Our freedom was limited, and we were not treated as equals in the country of our birth. Now, this was not only a political arrangement. This was not even only a moral arrangement. There were churches in our country who gave theological legitimation to the apartheid system. So in responding to apartheid, we had to also respond theologically, because we heard the pseudo-gospel which said apartheid is South Africa's solution, is God's solution for the rich diversity of the South African nation. And in that specific context, we had to say, this is not how we understand the Christian gospel. And though we didn't then use the notion of public theology explicitly, we were doing public theology. We were doing especially three things. We investigated the inherent public contents of our faith. We knew if we pray, that prayer is public. In the mid-1980s, a book was even published with the title, When Prayer Makes News, when we prayed collectively for the fall of the apartheid regime. Ellen Bussack, one of our big theologians, was co-editor of that very important book. So we focused on public theology as investigating and illuminating the inherent public content of Christian faith. And so the story of Zacchaeus and the way justice is used in Old and New Testament, reconciliation, the way it is used, that is one focus for us in public theology then, and it was the focus during the transition to democracy, 1990 to 1994, and with the birth of democracy in 1994, building a strong democracy, that question, that theme, revealing the public content of faith is important. But there's a second theme, also investigate the public rationality of our faith, the public reasonability, the public logic of the faith. And there you work together with other disciplines in interdisciplinary fashion, multidisciplinary, even transdisciplinary, meaning that we work also out of disciplines, that we work with reflective practitioners in saying, but what we believe here, this faith is not a faith that asks you to commit intellectual suicide. So in a sense, it's a form of polemics and also of constructive apologetics to make the faith accessible to those outside the tradition as well, is a second emphasis. And the third one, where a lot of our energy goes into, is to say, this faith has implications for all dimensions of life. It impacts on all dimensions, on the political domain, the economic domain, ecological, civil society, public discourse, public opinion formation, public policy, formulation and implementation. So public contents then is important, public rationality, and in the end, the public significance and implications of faith. That's our journey in South Africa. And in my own work, I really strongly try to say these sets of questions must be addressed when you do public theology. I then developed and asked, what is a specific Christian contribution to public theology? And there I, in my own work, revived the notion of the threefold office of Christ. And I try to reflect on Christ, not in a Christo-monistic way, but saying, no, when I talk Christ, I do it in Trinitarian framework, believing in the God of Christ, the Spirit of Christ, and the Spirit of God. So in Trinitarian fashion, I then focused on the threefold office, and it helped me to develop three foci in my work, namely talking about Christ as prophet, gives the key to a prophetic public theology. Talking about Christ as the priest paves the way for doing a priestly public theology. And talking about Christ as the royal servant help us to develop a public royal servant public theology. And I then specifically, for me, it was important over the years during to unpack each one of these, especially the prophetic public theology, to say, and here I drew on work from the World Council of Churches in 1988. The American theologian James Gustafson did an analysis of how the World Council of Churches speak prophetically, and how they speak in different modes. And based on that work, I developed an own framework for prophetic theology to say, if you do prophetic theology, you do 5 things. You envision a new society. You offer self-criticism and public criticism. Secondly, you tell the stories of injury, but also the stories of healing. Thirdly, you do technical and scientific analysis of the challenges we face. And then fifthly, you also engage in policy formulation. So it's prophecy as policy as the fifth one. During apartheid, we to a high extent focused on the envisioning side of things and the criticism side of things. We told the stories, we did technical analysis, but we were not that much engaged in policy formulation. And I believe to do prophetic theology in the context of a democracy, we have to adhere to at least all 5 these modes for prophetic speaking. And the priestly theology is about overcoming alienation. It's about what Sebastian Kim just mentioned now, building reconciliation that brings people together and that also enhances justice. And priestly is about healing the wounds of our people. And the royal servant one is, the emphasis there is very strongly to practice faithful citizenship, responsible citizenship, faithful discipleship, and also to live with hope, realistic hope, responsive hope, and resilient hope. And so these modes and models and approaches that I developed was born in the context of apartheid South Africa. It was nurtured by the great victory that we felt when Nelson Mandela was released and we moved to a new democracy. And at the moment, it is nurtured in a context where the democratic vision is not fully materialized yet. We struggle to build a life of dignity for all, healing for all, justice for all, freedom for all, equality for all. And in this context where we work hard to implement the vision by doing public theology in communion with local and international partners like the ones I'm sharing this wonderful time with now.
Thank you. You know, as a pastor, I could say listening to you, Nico, I was already drawing about maybe 10 or 20 sermon titles and that you can draw that how this is actually very applicable in a congregational context. And I think that arises from where you come from and what you were talking about. And not only that, that emphasis on the three focal points of Christ, the office of Christ, was an interesting revisiting of these, where how that relates to public theology. And I think something that you said was very interesting too, that there was this element of we share the stories of healing and injury and also scientific analysis, especially the last part of the practical side that you were talking about. But you're actually nudging us forward towards this paying attention to policy, especially in this democratic context. I think this is something that is arising more and more. And especially during these times of COVID, a lot of policies are being drawn up, or recommendations or restrictions, or things that oftentimes govern us, but it's not necessarily in terms of law, but in terms of how we are going to relate to each other, especially with the government. Now, in the light of the pandemic, and I think right now we can move into more like a conversational mode. I mean, thank you for presenting your various approaches and public theology. We can go into a conversational mode. The fact that we are having this conversation right now is because of the pandemic, and we are doing it in this format using Zoom. But some are already talking about this so-called new normal. Now, I guess for some people, this is actually a new abnormal. What are some challenges and opportunities that you've seen doing public theology today? Whether it's about the virus-related matters, or vaccination, or various policies related around that, the struggles of stories of healing and injury that is still prevalent right now, still happening, the inequality of it all that has been revealed. Some said it's not that it has caused it, but actually this has revealed some deeper issues, whether economically, politically, socially, and so on. So I just like to open it to whoever would like to jump in. What do you see are the challenges and opportunities in doing public theology, especially now in the time of physical distancing and social distancing? Maybe go back to Sebastian to get the ball rolling, and others can just chip in as you wish.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, it is kind of unprecedented experience, but in a sense that our history tells that, I mean, it's not that new. We have had a series of pandemic, even worse than this. But I think this particular time is really reveals the kind of our nature of what we call civilization we have built in so far. I think the French philosopher talked about this issue, saying that even though we have had quite a number of pandemic, but this pandemic really shows the kind of individualistic, kind of arrogance nature of human being society currently we are facing. So in many ways, pandemic affected the Western countries, Europe and USA, by and large because of the kind of human pride and confidence, overconfidence. But now we are facing this inequality within the society, as well as the kind of nationwide. So in this context, I'm just thinking about the church's response to this situation. In many ways, we have been bystanders, not active, not playing the prophetic role. I think that's very sad to see, particularly when it comes to the USA. The pandemic issue is very much polarized and politicized. So depending on which political party you stand for, your action or reaction are very clear. So it's just ignoring all the common sense and so on. So I mean, it is very sad. And church in many ways actually perpetuate that or the kind of exaggerate those situations. So it is a very sad situation. And I think Martin Marty, the public theologian, well-known public theologian, talks about public church, and he's criticizing the tribalist approach or exclusivist approach and individualistic approach. And I think that's really kind of, again, it comes to the surface. So it is very sad to see that we are really bearing burden of the people who are suffering, are really looking into the justice issue, and we are speaking out this matter. And I think in many ways we kept silent, particularly in the USA. In my own country, in Korea, the churches by and large supportive of the government policy and supportive of this dealing with the pandemic. But in many ways, some of the fundamentalist groups talks about this as a persecution of the, or closing the church as a kind of persecution and issue of liberty issue. So which really lost credibility among the people. So it is really challenging for us how to deal with that. I think recently Anti-Right published a book on God and pandemic, and he talks about the kind of people trying to find the solution or answer about this pandemic, the meaning of pandemic. But he said that basically Christian theology hasn't got answer to this. But he suggests instead that we need to do one thing is the two things is the we need to lament, identify with those who are suffering, and show our solidarity with those who are mourning for the loss of their loved ones and suffering because of the economic hardship and so on. And secondly, we should acknowledge our weaknesses and our hopelessness and repent of our arrogance and ask for God's intervention. I would add that public theology, and from public theology perspective, we should act and showing prophetic law, and also show the support for the poor and needy. And I think that's the most important issue. I recently at Fuller Theological Seminary, we talked about the rethinking church and how do we understand the role of the church in the public. Particularly, Fuller has evangelical tradition and traditionally support of, or quite a number of aspects of the evangelical churches in the USA has been supportive of more white population. And so we are really reflecting on the issue, whether we are really following the prophetic tradition of the Christ and actively involved in this justice issue.
I'm thinking of going to Nico because as I was listening to Sebastian, it's now about how the church sometimes is not helping, right? But actually it's becoming harmful. And I'll come back to Seferosa afterwards because I was thinking about climate just now because you mentioned that and the link to that, probably that circle. But it's actually, I'm reminded of what my general secretary said one day as he was speaking that to a church. You know, Reverend Dr. Martin Junger said, "Spread the gospel, don't spread the virus." You know, we are called to protect our neighbors and love our neighbors. And Nico, you talked about the gospel, how the gospel was understood wrongly, in ideologically wrong way during times of apartheid. And we know that now South Africa was really hit very hard and still is very much impacted by the pandemic. So I just wonder, what are your reflections on the challenges and opportunities? And some dear friends of ours in the Public Theology Network, you know, were infected and they died because of COVID and all that. So this is actually not something far away, but quite personal, I guess, to you and to all of us. What would you say to this, in this so-called new normal? You know, what are the challenges, and what would you say to this?
Yeah, it's indeed very existential. At the time of this conversation, we have just entered the third wave in South Africa, and the Delta variant had just been identified, and it's spreading in our country. On a personal level, just this past weekend, 3 days ago, I buried the brother of my wife who died a COVID-related death very suddenly, and an uncle and an auntie of mine, wife and husband, in 2 weeks after each other. The auntie was also buried this past Saturday, but I couldn't attend. And you experience the emotion of sadness, but also of fear for infection whilst you are mourning. So we have challenges. We have this priestly challenge of how are we practicing priestly presence in a context of so-called social distancing. I liked it when we, in the ecumenical discussions since COVID started, to say, please, let's not use the notion of social distancing, because it can so easily lead to social alienation, to the breakdown of social cohesion and social solidarity. So a priestly approach would be to say physical distancing. And how do we practice priestly presence amidst crucial physical distancing? That's a big challenge for us as churches. And I experienced it with a funeral this past weekend, where literally, where you normally would hug, you cannot do it. But how are we present? And I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis, our great Christian thinker, who addressed the University of Cambridge, the community of the university community during World War II. And he then made a great point when he said, during that war, you experience an intensification of existing concerns. And we experience that, that the existing concerns are intensified. But we also can add to C.S. Lewis and say we must now experience an intensification of innovation. We really need priestly innovation to say, how are we present? And I mean, technology helps us in that regard, and we must know technology cannot replace, I think, total physical presence, but we must use it as optimally as possible, also in the mourning processes and in the grief processes. But that's for me one big emphasis, to be practice priestly presence, but on the other hand also the prophetic role that we must fulfill. We have an intensification of inequality. I mean, in South Africa and in so-called southern countries, we see our vaccination rates are still very low, and you see in so-called northern countries how, in the light of existing inequality, the vaccination rates are higher. So COVID comes and reveals the existing concerns, and it even intensifies it again. So we need a consistent prophetic response to that, of yes, criticism, of reminding of the vision, of telling the stories, but also of engaging in technical analysis to that inform new policies. And I think COVID time is a time to look afresh at our policies. And policies for me such a great word when Jeremiah says, go and seek the well-being of the city, the polis. He also means go and seek the right policies for good life in the polis. And the last thing also for us that we experience very strongly, and I'm so nurtured by the ecumenical movement, the emphasis on and this is the royal servant response of hope, to say don't settle for Tina, there is no alternative. But I developed here, and I recently addressed our campus senate, the university senate, and the university council, and I use the notion of Tanya. Hope means there are new and innovative alternatives, and this is a time to look at, to imagine new alternatives. And we must, during COVID time, also make sure that though we are disoriented, there's not high levels of predictability, but amidst this time of uncertainty, I think we must nurture hope, but hope that helps us to imagine new alternatives to the ones that we've entered this virus with. Our Dean of Medicine at our university here uses the notion of we've moved from one abnormal to a new abnormal. And I think the challenge for us is now use the time that we can really move closer to the norm of God's kingdom and queendom.
Thank you, Nico. As I was listening to you, you're also reminding us that public theology not only has a prophetic dimension, but especially in this time, there's a priestly side of it that's needed, much for the healing of the soul, of the body, and attending to that. And really appreciate that. And of course, you shared very personally how it has impacted your family and your own life and pastoral practice. So thank you so much for sharing that. And when you mentioned the word home, it actually drew me back to what Seferosa talked about. One of the key words that for her approach was home. And now all of us, most of the time, are stuck at home for more than a year. And yet we also have this common home of the earth.
Yes.
And now we are very much aware of it, as well, how interconnected we are and all that. So Seferosa, Seth, just share with us maybe what you have been hearing from our two colleagues, but also your own thoughts on this so-called new abnormal, new normal or abnormal times, exceptional.
Yeah.
It is.
I actually am warming to the word abnormal, I think, because I have a concern with the new normal, because I'm not quite sure what the new normal is or what it would look like. So I think abnormal is something a term I could settle for right now. I want to actually say that, as Nico was saying, on the one hand, the pandemic has exposed the cracks and has exacerbated the cracks that, of existing inequalities that are already existing. But on the other hand, it has made the issues and concerns revealed actually invisible. And what I mean by this is there was a strong push to get gender-based violence visible, because when people, when everyone's at home, the violence increases with the stress. And that kind of became an untold story, and increase the vulnerability of those already at risk. So this is women and children, and also LGBTIQ. Now, this was something that came up and that I learned from by listening to an advertisement on the Fiji radio, which I was very pleased about, because sexuality is a taboo subject already in the Pacific. You put in LGBTQIA, and that's even a more taboo subject. And yet these people are at risk. And here is a public radio announcement that's saying, and supported by the Methodist Church in Fiji and the Fiji Council of Churches, in actually, encouraging encouraging people to actually treat those most vulnerable with dignity and with care. And the other issue too that's kind of gone sideways, kind of gone behind the curtains, is climate change. When we're looking at, particularly in the Pacific, they feel it more strongly, because all of a sudden COVID takes the headlines, and all talk about climate change and the dangers that they are facing kind of just sits there in the background, but it has not gone away. But yet COVID takes center stage. And I guess what seems to be happening is that the connections are not being made between, particularly with climate change and COVID that we're experiencing at the moment. And this was something that the Indigenous peoples have brought up by saying is that, well, we've been warning people for centuries that if we don't care for biodiversity, if we don't care for creation, these sorts of things are going to happen. And making the link between the COVID virus and the sort of development of extractive industries, in terms of logging and mining, that actually makes not only creation, but every human being vulnerable. So, I guess that's my reading of it is, yes, on the one hand, it's, all these concerns and issues are exposed, but on the other hand, they've kind of become invisible and therefore that's the prophetic in needing to push and keep these issues at the forefront. And I think for me, that's the challenge for the current time, is how COVID can become a mask, for everything else. And another example is in terms of Indigenous peoples. Many of them were beginning to lose access to their lands or even lose their lands because governments were using this time to actually do what they needed to do to legitimize the taking of their lands. And some Indigenous communities were actually cut off from their own natural resources. But these are the stories that we don't often get to hear about because COVID is so much at center stage. So, part of the challenge is, how do we work with this particular issue and yet keep everything side by side? Because in the end, everything's interconnected and interwoven, and we can't deal with one without dealing with all the rest. So, that's the challenge for me. And I guess it's also the opportunity for churches at this time to rethink what church is. Because as we go zooming, we go inward, our public face or our public interactions become less and less because we become more of a Zoomy kind of church. And yet within the Zoom community, there are inequalities. And we continue to have this struggle in terms of time zones. I mean, it comes down to, how do we have, equal sharing of time zones? And at the moment, it's the Pacific, Oceania, that's always on the receiving end of having to be 1-2 o'clock in the morning. So these are the things I think, and this is where I think the prophetic nature of public theology can continue to lift, is to actually, keep the marginalized, the often already invisible voices visible on the table or in front of us. And I guess I end with Gandhi. Gandhi said, well, when you're making policies or you're deliberating over policies in your boardrooms, have the face of the poor in front of you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think that was a very fitting challenge at the end that was going to lead us to the next question, because having the face of the person, of the poor, of the marginalized in front of us also forces us to ask the question, what next? What does it mean, not only for them, but for us? And as we have heard so much, not only of our approaches, our starting points, dealing with the new normal, new abnormal challenges, opportunities, with all that you have shared thus far, I just wonder, how do you see the future? And I know I actually forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sivin Kit, Reverend Dr. Sivin Kit from Malaysia, and I'm the program executive for public theology and interreligious relations. And that reminds me as well that other religious communities and faith communities are also wrestling with these questions. It's not just us Christians, but together we are looking into policy matters in the public. So there's a pluralistic world that we are living in that is very, we're all in this together. And I'm reminded of the importance of looking to the future. You mentioned a little bit about the opportunities. Do you have some hope to the future, or what should be the future of public theology in your view? And let's say if you were to write a letter, well, some of us still do, not just an email, but write an email, write a letter to a future public theologian, what would you say to them? Whether it's young or older, men, women, people from different backgrounds, or even our friends from people of other faith communities, what would you say is the future of public theology? Of course, starting from where we are, from a Christian perspective, but I guess moving beyond from where we are. So who would like to go for this? Sebastian?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for this question. Yes, even though I am majoring in public theology, I often talk to students that I don't really care whether public theology remain as a public theology discourse in the future. I think public theology serves as a catalyst to bring the justice and peace and reconciliation in this society. I think I'm quite familiar with the liberation theology, political theology, Black theology, and other theologies. Each serves the purpose and play the role in bringing God's kingdom into our society. And I think public theology also has a distinctive contributions to make. I think there are a number of contributions to make, and I think continue to make, is that one is we are looking at the system policy, and I think Sivin just to talk about policy. The South African theologian John Decrucci talks about, when he talks about Christianity and democracy, he talks about democratic vision and democratic system. And I think that's quite interesting perspective, because John Decrucci talks about the Christianity has been providing the democratic vision to the church and to society. But we need to build up the system in order to have a sustainable vision. And I think that's an important aspect for public theology to continue to contribute to make a system, make policy, so that we don't have to constantly ask for the charity, ask for favor from those who have and those who are in authority. We need to change the policy. We need to build up the sustainable and just system. And the second point that I would like to emphasize, that the public theology can serve a catalyst to meet the need of secular context in the modern and postmodern era. Because I think the public theology is geared to the conversation with secular people. So not only within the Christian circle, but also in conversation with wider society. And I think that has a great advantage of building communities of communities and working together and for the common good. And thirdly, I think also public theology can serve the purpose of the bridge between various theological positions, particularly between the liberals or progressive and conservatives. Because what I believe public theology its approach is the reforming approach rather than a radical or revolutionary approach. So it constantly try to bridge and constantly make conversation with various different disciplines at different theological orientations. So those are the quite positive aspects, and I think it should continue when we are working on the making theology available to the wider society. But there are some challenges and issues, and particularly I would like to continue to emphasize that public theology need to work on or conversation with the biblical scholars and insight into public discourse. When we talk about the liberation theology, the starting point of liberation theology is the story of Exodus. But what I see is the public theology, the kind of starting point of public theology is the wisdom literature, wisdom tradition. Because as you know, wisdom literature has both secular and sacred dimensions, and it is in the sacred text, but it uses a lot of secular understanding, secular knowledge and wisdom from outside. And I think that's very important for the public theologian to constantly work on that. And then also we need to work on the with the systematic theologians, particularly when you talk about what do we mean by public, when we look at the theologically, what do we mean by public and the common good, and what do we mean by the kind of integration between the various different societies, how to serve, how to theology can serve this. I mean, when it comes to this, the kind of future of public theology, I would like to say is there will be a great contributions to make, and we will need to deal with the various different issues. Therefore, we need to develop various methodologies to deal with that. At the same time, we need to also develop the distinctive approach to particular issues. And I think often people talk about the public theologies plural rather than public theology singular, because various people have different interests, and we developed our own distinctive approaches, methodologies, but at the same time, we have a common understanding, common sharing ideas, so that we can interact with each other. So I would like to say that it is it has a very positive future, and as I define public theology as a critical, reflective, and reasoned engagement of theology in the public sphere, we will need to constantly be critical and reflective of our own conduct, and prepared to be reasoned, prepared to be a reasonably engagement in the society with theology.
Thank you so much. And as I was listening to you, my mind turned to our reluctant public theologian. I think it was Seferosa who said that, I was quite reluctant to call myself a public theologian. But then how do you see the future, even as you listen to Sebastian? And Nico, we'll have you wrap up at the end, looking into the future, because you mentioned about, we were doing public theology, but we didn't call it public theology. So of course we are not, it's a placeholder, it's a label that helps us to have this conversation, but I guess we're all interested more in the content of it. And of course, moving forward to develop and see how it can contribute to theological discourse in public as well as affecting the church. So for you, Seferosa, what do you see as the future? How should we approach it? Doing public theology. I know you alluded to some of it already in your earlier comments, but perhaps you could zoom it into a couple of key points that you want to share with those who are doing public theology today towards the future. Yeah.
I think one of the areas, and that I mentioned, but I think that it actually embodies and covers a whole number of things that I was talking about. And that is the continuing development of an engagement between public theology and missiology that I spoke about earlier. Let me give you an example, because one of the, how I also came into public theology as well, or saw the need of a public theology, was when I was co-supervising Pacific Island students' thesis on contextual theology and public theology. And what I then realized at that point is that the Pacific, and going back to context, the Pacific has been so focused on contextuality that it's actually lost the public or the prophetic nature of theology. So what we have is a reclaiming and recovering of culture as something that's God-given, that can inform our theologies, but it's come at the expense of how theology then engages the public. And so, when you're in a coup culture, public theology, liberation theology becomes very critical. And so, you know, that's when I realized that there needs to be that extra sort of aspect alongside contextuality that needed to be, you know, engaged with. And why I guess I'm picking on missiology is perhaps because, you know, being a byproduct of Christian missions and colonization, I still think that there is much that we still need to interrogate in terms of also how that theology continues to play out, for example, in our racism. And we kind of need to go back to that. And when you kind of do the analysis on colonization and Christian mission, you kind of see how it's all been intertwined and entangled with capitalism, with imperialism. And so these things need to kind of be unraveled in order. And I think for me, what is critical for me is also practice, is how does our theology become lived, like really lived, not just in terms of these are great statements and great theologies, but how do they actually perform when the rubber hits the road? And I guess that's the practical theologian coming out of me that says, okay, how does this play out in real life and in everyday life, in, you know, in churches, in people's own lived everyday Christianity? So I think that, you know, for me, missiology is kind of a key. I think that more work needs to be done with that. I'm also just really excited and more hopeful listening to both Nico and Sebastian in terms of the future. And I think, yes, there are, you know, there's still opportunities, because I was beginning to kind of feel, where are we going with this, you know? And how does it make a real impact on people's lives? But hearing you, Nico, and the context of apartheid, and the resistance and the struggle and the resilience that kind of continues is just incredible. So it's that kind of sort of those sorts of values, I think, and hope. That's where I see where hope is lived. That I think if that continues to be a part of what we do as public theology, then, you know, it has a great future, prophetic future.
And
So
all of us are part of this process, and hopefully through this conversation we can encourage others to shape that future together. And Nico, you know, earlier in our preparation as we were talking, I was jokingly saying that there's no such thing as retired, or maybe we retire, as in change your tire to move on into a new journey. And I don't think you're thinking about retirement that soon, but I'm sure you have things you would like to say to us, younger folk, about the future, or the students that you are working with, and especially in the context of a university as well. And I really was very moved when you said we are not committing some intellectual suicide doing this. It's not just about being polemical, but we really want to be intellectually rigorous in what we do. And Seth already reminded us about the practice side of things. Sebastian talked about the systems, so it's not just about a vision. So there's so many different ingredients that we have laid before us right now. So how do you see the future? How should we approach doing public theology in the future? And this is really a long-term view, because just like the whole issue of apartheid, some people thought it was just that moment, but it's not. It is many moments, many more days to come. And I think we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I thank you for the question and the remarks, and I'm inspired really by Kim and Seferosa, by Sebastian and Seferosa. And I think if we just perhaps very briefly, if we talk about public theology, we often hear people say it's a tautology. And I agree with it. In a sense, if you say theology, you have in mind reflecting about God who loves the world, the cosmos so much, all publics. So public theology alone already focuses on all publics, but we have to make it explicit. And it is until we are really, as churches and with other religious communities, present in all publics of life in appropriate fashion, then we say, we can say the tautology doesn't exist anymore. We just say theology. But in South Africa, we experienced it so much that with the transition to democracy, churches had to redefine our roles, and some said, no, we can go back and do our real business and just be church. Nelson Mandela is liberated, so leave the political terrain to the politicians. And we soon discovered, oh no, that's not the gospel imperative. We need to be present, and the notion of public theology encourages us to go to, like you said, spread not the virus, but spread the gospel to all publics of life. So that's the first thing. On how public theology will evolve, that is great. That's for me exciting. Some make it a discipline or a sub-discipline. Others says, no, it's just a focus in theology. I think we must be open. The important thing is just as long as we can say, as a practical theologian or a missiologist or an Old Testament scholar, the publics of life are important for me. And the research that I do on the use of justice in the Old Testament must impact on public life, on all dimensions of life. So that is as far as the future in terms of discipline-orientedness of public theology is concerned. And then also relationship with feminist and womanist theology, that's also for me important to see that we have in South Africa a feminist theologian like Denise Ackerman who would say, I'm doing public theology. I focus my work on all publics of life. And so we must be easier on that. I wrote about drinking from the wells of liberation theology. So it's not public against liberation or against contextual or against womanist. But if I talk about specifically where we are now in South Africa and worldwide, democracy is under threat. And Sebastian referred to John de Groot's very good distinction there, that there's a democratic vision that I think we must remind people of, especially in COVID time. You have dignity. There's going to be healing for you. We will treat you with justice and freedom and equality. That vision must be kept alive. And I think public theology must play that role. But we also need practices and policies and institutions to embody that vision. And here I think it's important then that it's a luxury then just to talk on the level of vision and criticism. We must tell the stories and bring it under the attention of policymakers. We must do technical analysis, do hard work. We cannot become economists, but really there are economists who can guide us to talk in a more credible way about economic justice, for instance, to make more credible inputs to policy making regarding economic matters. And we have those people as gifts to us to help us as theologians and churches to go forward in that prophetic fashion. But we also need, I think, to work on our language. I think I'm thinking about the rhetoric that we should use. We really need to use a language that makes us understandable in a pluralistic context. And I think then the future for public theology would also be discover the old practice of polemics, that in the Christian community, we can debate issues, we can differ, practice tolerance and embrace and come closer to the truth. And the old classic practice of apologetics, constructive apologetics, make our faith claims accessible to people from other religious traditions and from secular traditions, and try to seek a way forward within Christian communities, in the ecumenical movement amongst Christian denominations, but broader also to other religions and to people of so-called non-religious orientations. That's the type of agenda that I see. And then the agenda of reconciliation, the priestly reconciliation and healing that we seek, but then a healing in search of overcoming alienation and building justice. And here I want to emphasize justice to the most vulnerable should be the yardstick. In my days as a student, we heard that Ellen Busak asked us, what is the most significant contribution of liberation theology? And he then said, it is that in all policies you make, in all decisions you take, you ask, what's the impact to those on the margin? And therefore, I like the idea, Seferosa, of mission from the margin. The insights, the news that we receive from the margin must determine how we go forward and how we define justice. And I would say, in conclusion, then, if I could write a letter to younger theologians, I would say the Royal Servant Office, which says the hope that we have is a realistic hope. Christ is real, his resurrection is real, resurrection victory is real, our faith is rational. Secondly, our faith is responsive. It doesn't say goodbye to the world, it makes us responsible for the world, and it's resilient, especially in COVID time. It's elastic, that our hope is, you can say you can stretch us, but we, by God's grace, shall not be broken. And based on that hope, I think we can also say we need in the world ethical leadership, ethical citizenship, and drawing from this royal servant paradigm of public theology, I think we can in future say, in a country like ours, where the ex-president had just hours ago, as we do this recording, been sentenced to jail. In a country of so much corruption, but also so much hope, it is important that we say we live with resilient hope. We go forward and we spread this wonderful gospel news that what we hold on to is not wishful thinking. It's the biggest reality, the reality of the resurrected and present Jesus Christ right now here with us as we commune in this way.
Thank you very much. I'd like to appreciate all three of you for really contributing your time, your insights, your experience, your reflections. And I think this, at least for me, really nudges me forward. And I think many others who are engaged in this work towards this realistic hope that, Nico, you talked about, wrapped up at the end, a realistic hope that's resilient. And we have been challenged to be resilient in the past more than 1 year around the world. And I think in these interconnected times, while physically distant, we actually drawn socially even more connected. And I think spiritually and theologically, I like to thank you for pushing us forward, but also not forgetting the contributions of the past and also the voices that often we neglect. So on behalf of the organizers, the Bayers Another Institute for Public Theology in Stellenbosch, and also the Berlin Institute for Public Theology, that's part of the Theological Faculty of the Humboldt University of Berlin, and the Lutheran World Federation, we'd like to just thank you for your contribution to this course that is very much contextual and yet also intercontextual and possibly even more trans-contextual as we are discussing this moving towards the future. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Sivin.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.